Hello, everyone. My name is Gorecki. My goal with this podcast is to talk to interesting people from my life about engineering, technology, and their experiences. My guest today is Lennon Rodgers. Lennon is the director of the Grainger Engineering Innovation Design Labs at UW-Madison. Lennon has his PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT and has experience designing and building complex systems ranging from spacecraft to electric vehicles. He has helped design a miniature docking port that is on the International Space Station, as well as led a student team that built electric motorcycles for the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, one of the oldest motorcycle races in the world. Lennon was also a mechanical engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, where he worked on the Keck and TMT telescopes in Hawaii. On top of that, he helped set up makerspaces across the world in places like Russia and Singapore. Lennon has one of the most diverse backgrounds of anyone I've ever met, and I really enjoyed this conversation with him, and we've really only scratched the surface of what I would have wanted to explore with him. I hope you guys enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thank you. So there's a lot to your background, and I don't know if summarizing all of it is gonna that'd probably take the entire time that we have. But if you could give kind of a quick summary on who you are, what your background is, and kind of how you ended up where you are today, that would be a good place to start.
Sure. My name's Lennon Rodgers, and I'm the director of the Grainger Engineering Design Innovation Labs at UW-Madison, and that kind of includes the makerspace and the machine shop. And I guess what I'm really passionate about is just helping students with projects, hands-on learning, interdisciplinary collaborations, and so those are some of the things that we try to foster within the lab. Um, I, so I guess in terms of brief background, I came here 6 years ago, and was previously at MIT where I was a research scientist for a while. But then before that, I lived abroad for a while. I was a grad student for quite a few years at MIT, and I worked before that at the Jet Propulsion Lab out in Pasadena. Um, and and then I went to my undergrad degree was at University of Illinois down at Urbana-Champaign, and there all my degrees are in mechanical engineering.
Yeah, so there's so many different things I want to talk to you about because you're honestly so after learning a bit about your background, you seem to be one of the most diverse people that I know in terms of just experience and focus in terms of the things that you've worked on. I mean, again, as a summary, like I know you worked in Hawaii, right, on a telescope for a while. You did
Yep.
electric motorcycles. You've worked as a researcher and now you're direct there's so many
It's
places I
kind of
want to.
eclectic.
Yeah, well, and so I guess to start off, how did this path kind of start? Because if I remember correctly, you didn't start off wanting to be an engineer, right? If
Mhm.
I remember correctly, it was something you wanted to do something with art. um
Yep.
how did that kind of pivot to today?
Yeah, I started out as an art student back when I was 18, and it was probably more an indication of just not really sure what I wanted to do. But in high school, I was really involved with music primarily, and then started dabbling in art, photography, more later in high school, but still really involved with music. And then when I was going away to college, I just had to pick a major, and so that was the thing that was closest. But then I also really liked motorcycles, and so that had been something I liked for a while. But it just took me a while to make that connection between my interest in motorcycles and then engineering. So because I didn't have any engineers as parents or anyone close to me, I just didn't know that that's what I was. But then eventually I found out that's who I was. Um,
That's really interesting for me to think about because I grew up with my dad being a mechanical engineer, and
mhm.
he was kind of one of those guys that would always fix stuff and was always kind of building things. um Growing up, I ended up helping him out with a lot of stuff, and I think part of it was my personality as well. I think I was always going to kind of be an engineer, but I
Mhm.
think that kind of fostered it as well, which was I kind of had this environment in which I could get my hands on stuff. um it was funny because as I was growing up, I always thought my dad was like, I thought he really enjoyed what he was doing and he really liked building and learning. And I think he does to some degree, but I also found out later that was because he was just too cheap to pay somebody to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was really funny to me
Yeah.
because I actually like really enjoy doing some of that stuff. I think he does too, but
Yeah.
that was kind of funny.
Yeah. No, it's true. I think at first, because now I work a lot with students, and I think those first 2, 3 years in college, really the first 1 or 2, are just so pivotal. And so they certainly were for me. I try to help other students if I can. For the most part now, it's some students I think are questioning their identity as engineers,
Mm,
and I try to encourage them and get them excited back into engineering. I was more outside of engineering coming in from with a different identity. My identity was all around like more the creative spaces. But yeah, my dad was very similar to yours, and my dad was also an engineering, has an engineer's mind, but he just didn't go that path. He was interested in airplanes and other things, but his kind of an interesting story. But he didn't go down the engineering path. But then I actually do have a whole side, my dad's whole side of the family. There is a history of engineers. It just I wasn't really influenced by him. And again, it's a lot about the identity thing, which is it just who I was
hmm.
going into college at that time was not engineering. But then I just kind of was able to make some connections between what who I was, and then also started looking at longer term career. And then also, like what you mentioned, is that some of the adventures that I started having were all thanks to engineering, and I was like, this is awesome. Like, yeah, yes, this is definitely what I want to do when I was starting to have these experiences. And I think that's one of the cool things about engineering is that there's so many opportunities for students, and sometimes it's a little harder in some of the other fields. So I was getting some traction in that space too, of just being able to have internships and start to have more engineering experiences. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, to start kind of going down that path and exploring some of those experiences, so I'm trying to think about it from the time when I started getting internships. And for me, it was rather difficult because you have to figure out a way to really separate yourself kind of from everybody
Mm-hmm.
else because they're looking for smart creative people and there's a lot of them. And so the question is, how do you start to get noticed? And some of your experiences, I mean, working with JPL, like that isn't, it's easy to look back now and just kind of blow past it, but I think that's not
Mm-hmm.
really a trivial thing, especially at that
Nope.
age. And so the
Nope.
question, I guess my question is like, how did you kind of start getting into those experiences? And did you feel like you had a different mindset than other people, or how did you go about kind of getting into that position? Because I don't want to skip past that. Like most people
Yeah.
don't work at JPL, you know what I mean?
Yep. No, I think that's a really good point. And it's definitely something I talk to students a lot about now. So I have a whole 1 hour chat that I do every once in a while talking about kind of the strategies. But the biggest thing that I start out with is, at least encouraging students, is just to be dreamers. So I was definitely a dreamer. I was a daydreamer, and I started dreaming up what I thought sounded cool and sounded fun and interesting. And that sounds so basic, but it just kind of comes naturally to me just to sit and fantasize. And I think you, with some of your backgrounds, a lot of those things start with like, wow, that would be cool. That like a jetpack, that sounds really cool.
That's okay. I don't want to take it off topic here, but that's
Yeah,
exactly how it started, which was
yeah,
it started off with me just kind of seeing what other people had done before. And I'm like, oh, that would be cool. Like who wouldn't
right,
want to have a jetpack? And then
right.
at some point, there was a connection that was made where I realized looking at it, I'm like, fundamentally, I actually understand most of what's happening there. Like it isn't
Mm-hmm,
magic to me, like I understand it. And not
mm-hmm,
necessarily every detail. But then once I realized I understood it, I was like, oh, I wonder if I could do it. And then I'd
mm-hmm.
lay there at night trying to fall asleep, and my mind was just, I was just designing it in my head. Um,
Yeah,
and so I totally understand what you mean there. And I think you're also right. I think that seems unique to like a lot of people I know don't describe anything like that. Um,
yeah, like kind of the daydreaming side. I think, or even just dreaming. So when I even talk to students about internships, I'm like, okay, everything I'm about to tell you is only useful for your dream internship. So start dreaming, dream up your ideal job, and so that's like that whole 1 hour talk that I do of just kind of my story about strategies I've used. But I think so. It was kind of that, just starting to daydream up. Now the good thing for me is that I didn't. I was from a small town in Illinois, and so I had a lot to dream about because there really wasn't a lot going on for me at that time. And so any small thing seemed awesome. like my first internship was actually through my network that I had, which is through my uncle, who was an engineer, but I just hadn't interacted with him a lot.
Mm.
But when I needed to get my first internship, and this is what I talk to students about, is just like go within your network, whatever it is. Most importantly, don't go back to your Best Buy job. That's usually what I say, and I just say Best Buy.
Yeah.
Do something in the direction of engineering, in the direction of what sounds cool or what's interesting or your dream at that time. And if you don't have a clear idea, just do something that sounds fun. So I actually went up my very first summer when I was switching out of art, and I got an internship with the company that my uncle was working for up in near Milwaukee, actually, coincidentally enough.
Mm.
And kind of long story short, I would say that from then on, there was, in hindsight, there was nothing super cool about that internship besides, I mean, it was cool to me at the time. It seemed like I was moving up into the big leagues because I was making more money and getting to move to a different town, far, like 3 or 4 hours away. So it seemed like opportunities were opening up. But then from then, it was just kind of that continual, just dreaming up things, looking for opportunities. So going back the next year, my brother-in-law was getting his MBA, and he said, "Hey, a group of us are going down to Louisville, Kentucky, of his MBA cohort. We're going to go down. We're going to check out General Electric. You want to go?" I'm like, "Sure." So I was also just willing to do whatever.
Yeah.
So I was a dreamer, but I was also willing to do whatever. I didn't overanalyze it too much. If it just sounded fun, I would just, sure, I'll come. When are you guys going? So we drove down to Louisville. I went down with them, and these are a bunch of much older people with MBAs. So I got in with that mix. I went down to GE, and long story short, I was able to get an interview to get an internship down there.
Mm.
So I did an internship at GE down in Louisville, Kentucky, once the next summer. But then when I was at Louisville, at GE Louisville, in Louisville, I started daydreaming up, man, I wonder what would it be like to work at GE Research out in New York?
Mm.
That's where like Thomas Edison used to work. That sounds really cool. Jet engines. And so that was kind of the daydreaming there. And so then just built really good relationships, tried to work hard and impress my managers down in Louisville. And so then they referred me out to New York. And so I went there the next 2 summers. And that's it kind of kept going like that, of just daydreaming, but working hard. And I think also definitely not daydreaming in the sense of not working at what I'm currently doing, because I worked really, really hard to do good work. I wasn't just always like daydreaming.
That's it.
I was actually going to work at GE. When I was going to graduate my senior year in undergrad, I was going to work at GE. They had offered me out in New York, the research center, a job, full-time job. But then I got a notice from JPL. So that's kind of where I got a letter from JPL, an email that said that they had found my resume in a stack that I'd submitted like years before that. And JPL was my dream. Like once I was at GE, then I started dreaming up about JPL, and that had been my dream for a long time. So that's kind of what led to that. And that was the Hawaii opportunity. Is that I got an email asking if I was interested in working in Hawaii on the Keck telescopes.
So there's a couple of things there that I want to hit that are pretty interesting. First of all, this idea of like dreaming forward of where you want to end up and then working towards it. I think that's really interesting because in my experience again, and everybody I think does it to some degree, but there aren't that many people I noticed, especially at least in my life, especially going through college and things
Yeah.
that really thought like that. And I don't know if that's necessarily a mindset that you just kind of have. And I wonder if part of that kind of comes from the artistic side that you focused on, because I think part of that kind of open daydreaming, it almost comes from like a very creative side. And I think some people don't explore that very much. And I honestly, for a long time, I didn't consider myself as being very creative. And I am kind of very structured and um, I am very like structured, and you made a comment about going down to Louisville and being like, oh, just open to any new experience
Right.
without over analyzing
Right.
it. And sometimes I fall into a trap of over analyzing, and sometimes it's a detriment, but sometimes it allows me to get things right very, very quickly sometimes, because I can look at all the different parts of it, but sometimes it just gets in my way. And sometimes there are
Yeah.
times where you just kind of have to say yes. And
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Do you think that that's part of your personality, or do you think that's kind of a muscle that you just learned how to flex, if that makes
I
sense?
think it's probably a part of personality for sure, because I have people that are close to me too, siblings and others, and it just they're not necessarily the same way. I think daydreaming comes a lot with a heavy dose of curiosity about things too. You know, being curious what that daydream, you start daydreaming, but then you become so curious about what that would be like. And that's come back to me in so many different ways, like motorcycling through the Himalayas and other places where I'm like, what would it be like to do that?
Hmm.
But it's a bit of a daydream too. But to get on the bus, get on, I think go down to Louisville thing, that's an important point actually, because, and I'll give an example of a recent student that works at the Makerspace. And kind of like what you're saying too, is that you'd think more people would do this, but they don't. Is that there was a company that was coming to Milwaukee. It was Form Labs, a 3D printer company,
Hmm.
um, and it was started by a classmate friend of mine. And so I told the other students, I was like, hey, if anyone wants to come to Milwaukee, they're going to come. And I was like, it'd be a great opportunity. And, it takes some effort to get over to Milwaukee. And no one really went besides maybe a couple. And one of the students like literally got on a bus and just made it. He just made it happen. He went over there and long story short, he put in a lot of work, but he got an internship there.
Yeah.
And he was thanking me. He's like, "Oh, thanks." I'm like, "Hey, I didn't do anything." I was like, "You're the one that got on the bus. I didn't. There were a lot of other students that could have gotten the bus." So anyway, so I think and obviously in his case, just that drive. He was very driven, to go, and so there's that curiosity, but then there's also the kind of the getting on the bus, going and taking some risks, and not everything results in some desired outcome. But I think in order to have some desired outcome, you have to get on the bus, a few
Yeah.
times and just go for it.
So with that in mind, what is your thought about luck and timing? Because sometimes, unfortunately, things come down to luck. And what you just said earlier about working at JPL, where they pulled your resume out of
Right.
a stack, like
Oh yeah.
that usually doesn't happen.
It
And
usually
with
doesn't.
something like
Yeah.
NASA, I mean, with Mary Claire having had an internship there, um,
Hmm.
if they're looking to fill two positions and they have 1,000 applications, 500 of which could easily be skilled enough to fill those positions, like usually luck isn't something you want to rely upon if you're actually trying to get into those kinds of
Hmm.
fields. So have you ever reflected on ending up at JPL was in some sense luck, or have you thought about that at all and how that plays in?
Yeah, well, to tell you, because it does sound like a little bit even more information of it, there's definitely something there. Because I had submitted my resume 2 years before that or something when a representative from JPL came to University of Illinois, like, and I went into the auditorium. They were giving a big talk, and there were like hundreds of engineering students in there, and I'm like, okay, there's no way I'm not
Yeah, yeah.
like what you're saying. And so I was like, he's like, well, if you'd like to submit your resume, you can bring it down, and I'm like, okay, I guess I will. So anyway, I did, and fast forwarding the 2 years is that every once in a while it does work, because there was this guy, Mark Swain is his name. He's ended up being a huge friend and mentor of mine. He was an astronomer at JPL, and he's like, hey, I'm looking for a mechanical engineer. He goes to HR because he's outside engineering, so he doesn't even know where to start. He's an
Right.
astronomer. So he says, hey, HR at JPL, I'm looking for an internship, an intern in mechanical engineering or something like that. So he just gave him a stack. This is quite a while ago. This is early 2000s. So he gave him a stack of resumes, and Mark just said that he started flipping through them and reading the CVs. And the thing that actually, according to Mark, what stood out initially was that I had worked at GE, and
Mm.
he had good thoughts about GE because of some of his past experience. So but even once Mark contacted me, he emailed me and said, do you want to come work on the Keck telescopes in Hawaii? And I was like, yes, basically.
So
But I had to still do an interview, and so that's kind of one of the things I talk to students a lot about is the interviewing process. So I don't know if you want to chat about that, but that
well,
got me in.
so
You're right. It could have been luck, but that got me at the door. But you still need to get that's not enough. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, you
Well,
know.
this is something I wanted to bring up at some point, and this is actually probably a perfect time to do it. And I don't remember if I learned this directly from you or if this was, I don't know if Mary Claire learned it from you and then I picked it up from her. But you, and I assume this is what you're teaching your students, but a lot of the reason I have the couple jobs that I've gotten was from some of the advice that you had given, which is how to think about the employee kind of employer relationship, and then
Yeah,
also how do you stand out, right? And
right.
so for my recent job, the one that I just started back in January, I do basically engineering consulting. This company, they take on clients, all sorts of stuff, and I want to get into a couple of the electric vehicles stuff,
Hmm.
but we'll get there in a minute. But basically, the way I ended up getting my job was from the advice that you had given, and I've actually talked. People have hit me up asking about how I've gotten some of my jobs, and I basically
Hmm.
echo the same advice, which is you need to make yourself stand out. And so basically what I ended up doing was first I applied online, right? Because but then after you apply online, that can't be the only thing that you do. So you have to go. I found the email of the engineering manager, and I actually had to kind of guess it because you can figure out what the domain of the company is, and then
Hmm.
you can figure out what their name is, and then how they structure it, and then you can see, well, does that actually show up as a legitimate email? And so then I
Hmm.
emailed them with my resume and cover letter, basically saying, hey, I applied online. I don't really know where this stuff goes. So I wanted to send this to you directly. Oh, and here's also a list of all the requirements that you had listed on your website. Here's all the reasons I match all of those things.
Right. Right.
And that got me a call back literally the next day.
Yeah.
And then within 2 weeks, I had a job offer. Now
Yeah.
the part that you just mentioned there, which is at the end of the day, that only gets you in the door. Now
Right.
you actually have to do well on the interviews. You have to do well on the
Hmm.
technical stuff. You have to know what you're doing. And so that's where things like working really hard, working on projects, exposing yourself to a lot of ideas, you just keep building that up and that will get you in the door. You learn to
Right.
communicate. If and as long as you can communicate all of that, I've gotten so many offers and jobs and had
Hmm.
good interviews because of all of that. So, and that's I think
Hmm.
that's a lot of the um that comes from a lot of the advice that you echoed. And so
Oh, good.
it's an
Yeah.
amazing way. Like I had never heard anybody else describe that, and I know adults who don't even think about how to get jobs in that way. And so having heard that come from you was extremely beneficial. So if that's what you're teaching students, I would say keep doing that because me and a lot of other people I've talked to have found that extremely useful.
Yeah, that's good.
So
No, there's a lot. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of strategies, and for me, it started back at GE. Actually, they have really good training. So I went through a lot of training when I was at GE, and then even since then, I've been on kind of both sides of it. I've been on the hiring side, and I've been on trying to get hired side. But even back to that first one, I think I did kind of get it naturally. Not I don't know, but I with Mark I wouldn't have gotten the gig, but Mark, this guy at JPL, this was the first time that I really got it when I talked to Mark. Was that basically, and it sounds similar to what you did. Um, Fast forward, I guess, is that really what Mark was doing with interviewing me? He's trying to lower his risk. He's
mhm.
risk mitigating, and I don't view it as a way of like I guess what it is that he's trying to understand. There's a lot of people that might think they want the job, but do they really want the job? Have I made the incremental steps? Am I really the right person to kind of meet their needs? I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about their needs.
Yeah.
So no, there's so much more. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
we could
We
chat
can and
all the
we
time
can we can go down
about
that path later.
strategy. Yeah,
Yeah, but
no, but
basically what
yeah, it's
yeah,
yeah,
what I wanted
that's
to say is that's great that you're teaching that, and I think that's
yeah,
really useful stuff. It's helped me out a lot.
yeah.
But continuing down, I want to continue
Hmm.
focusing on your work experience. So you end up saying you end up getting hired at JPL. You end up being presented with this experience of going to Hawaii and working
Yeah,
on a telescope.
yeah.
What was that experience like? You're showing up for the first time. Was there ever any like I don't want to say doubt per se, but like anything of like there's no way this is actually happening. Like, should I really be here?
Yes. Yeah. Pretty much. I mean, I hadn't even flown in a commercial airplane really.
Oh
I think
wow.
maybe one other time. Um, so it was the first time that I was really getting in an airplane flying. I'd never been to California, so I flew out to California. But yeah, a lot of time. Actually, you're right. I mean, that's no one's ever asked that before. But I was kind of going back, and again, this is like over 20 years ago. But I was just like, there was a side of me that's like, I don't know if this is really happening. And so yeah, then I went to California and it was oriented at JPL, which was awesome. And then again, the whole time I'm like, okay, it's going to end here. I'm not going to really be able to go to Hawaii, right, for 7 months, and they're gonna actually have an apartment for me there and everything. And
They're gonna pay you for it.
yeah, but even the technical side, I mean, I'm actually going to get to work on this telescope and work with these people, and but yeah, it was the real deal, and it was awesome, and I learned a lot, and I feel like I worked really hard. I was able to contribute in some small way, at least, for that age and that time, and it was really neat. I mean, it introduced me to a whole new world of astronomy that I didn't really know much about before. And I had been at GE, I'd been kind of going down the aircraft engine route, and I had a lot of the GE was amazing too. I got a lot of really awesome experiences there of working with their aircraft engine group, and working on some really neat projects. But anyway, going to JPL, then there was a whole nother set of technical challenges, and also the interdisciplinary piece was really neat of working with astronomers, because I was really the only mechanical engineer over there from JPL that was working on the telescope.
Oh wow.
So that was really neat too. So yeah, it was, and so yeah, this in the place is really unique. If have you ever been to the Big Island?
I have not. I'd like to go at some point, but it hasn't been something that's really crossed my mind at the moment to
Yeah,
seek out.
yeah, you got it. It's up at the summit. It's at 12,000 feet, and so we had to drive up there most of the day. So it was a very like rugged experience where you have to go to high altitude, working at high altitude, and you trying to use some of the engineering tools, but like in a real kind of like with your experience too. It's sort of the hands-on. It's like, okay, you learn this in class, but okay, how is it really going to work in the real world? How can you really get it to work? So it's a
Yeah,
little bit pragmatic in that way.
that was something that I struggled with school a lot. Coming into college was difficult because I found high school particularly easy, so I didn't learn the skills of how to study and how
Hmm.
to do school very well. And so then I came into college and realized like, oh, like I'm not particularly good at academics, and it's not something I necessarily enjoy. But one of the things I realized I enjoyed was like learning the academic side of things, but then being able to apply it and pull tangible skills out of it. And that's where I think it was my sophomore year is when I really started kind of I wanted to be an engineer, but that's really when I started to kind of identify more with like, I am an engineer. I like building
Hmm.
stuff. Like, this is what I do in my free time. This is what I enjoy doing. And I think that was the first time I took on my first like actual project, which was
Hmm.
an electric skateboard. And that I didn't know anything about charging lithium batteries. I didn't know
Yeah.
anything about brushless motors. Like, I had to learn all of that. Actually, now that I think about it, I think I remember interviewing with you at the Makerspace for like the position at the Makerspace. And I feel like I remember talking to you about that project. And I feel like we hit it
Probably, yeah,
off
that
because we
sounds
were talking
familiar.
about because I know I didn't know that you worked on electric vehicles at that time, but I was telling you about
Hmm.
this electric skateboard that I made. And I think if I remember correctly, that was a rather good interview. But again, it just goes back to
Hmm.
the point we were
Hmm.
making earlier that like
Yeah.
these practical skills and showing risk reduction, right, and showing that you're
Yeah.
interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
um
No, it's true. I mean, I think I wish there were more of you in some way, because I mean, you're kind of the kindred spirit, because I was similar, like in every way. I could have said the same thing that you just said. Um, and I think I was able, and some people can too, like I can do the academic stuff, but it's a bit disjointed in some ways from, sometimes it doesn't have to be, from projects, but I am able to kind of fulfill the academic requirements. But I think, like I continually, and we could chat more about this, is I had to learn the lesson where it's just hands-on is really important to me. I'm just not very happy unless it's something that I can touch and use, and so that even with the telescope, like that was actually really the first time that I started to see that, because I had just been an engineering student, and so it was all theoretical. As you know, I mean, engineering will do everything it can to, as an academic endeavor, beat a lot of the hands-on out. Now it's kind of coming back. It's gotten a lot better, but definitely when I was a student in undergrad, I mean, it was just nothing hands-on. I mean, there was
Yeah. I
almost
mean,
nothing.
I struggled with that too. The electrical engineering department at Madison, I think, is a little bit. The mechanical department seems pretty good about it. I think I struggle a little bit on the electrical side. And I really, once I got out of college, is when I feel like my learning really began, which is when I
Yeah.
started. And this was my justification to myself for putting the money and time and effort into building like the whole jet suit was like the
Mm-hmm.
amount of skills that I learned from that, like you can't replace that with anything. It's
Mm-hmm.
like a master's program almost. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've never been through
Yeah.
one, so I don't want to compare it too much. But at the same time, it's like I learned how to design circuit boards. I learned how to mechanically CAD. I learned how to run jet engines, like fuel systems, pumps, whatever. Like
Mm-hmm.
I learned so much, and so I totally get it. And that was always for me. I've always been such like a very concrete person, and so the theory is good because you have to start somewhere, but it doesn't really click for me until I can start putting my hands on it.
Mm-hmm.
So my question then is if
Yeah.
JPL being at the telescope was like the first time you're really seeing that, and you said you worked there for 7 months.
Well, yeah, that was that assignment, and that was it. That was essentially that was actually officially an internship. I ended up going back there as a full-time engineer, but later. But yeah, it was a 7-month internship in Hawaii, working on the telescope, very hands-on, very much like figuring out resonance frequencies of different mirrors, and um, but I would just say on a side note too, is that that internship was also influential because I met someone for the first time that could straddle both the theoretical and the real built world.
Mm,
And his name was Mark Colavita, and he had a PhD from MIT, and that was the first guy I'd met person kind of from MIT in general. But Mark was a guy. He was also an electrical engineer slash astronomer, and he could just whip out math and other things like it was a tool in a toolbox and analyze real systems. He'd be like, "Oh, give me that hammer, bang, bang, bang. Oh, okay, and then okay, this is a second order differential equation." And so anyway,
those
so that
are
was also cool, and
those
that's
are
what's
some
awesome about
competent.
internships. Yeah, that's what's awesome about internships. You know, you meet these people, and I met some great ones at GE too. But you meet these people that are older, more experienced, and you're just like, "Whoa, you know, that's awesome."
Well, what's interesting, that book that you sent me, the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works
Oh
book,
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
that was a
yeah,
prime example of
yeah.
the description of how some of those guys would think and how they would work.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing. And when you come across those people that can do both the theoretical and the
Mm-hmm.
hands-on, because usually you find those two things rather distinct. You find people who
Mm-hmm.
are really good hands-on, like great mechanics, but they don't
Right.
have the brain for like the math
Right.
side of things, and they don't need to. They have enough experience where they can usually eyeball it. And then you have some people who are very academic. They can do everything in simulation, but they don't know how to turn a wrench.
Right.
And if you find that person that's like has the cross between the two, and I mean, I aspired to that, but it's hard. But
Yeah.
those people, man, if you can find those people, like I imagine any organization would want those kind of people.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but
No, that's, I mean, that bridge is what, again, I aspire to do myself. And then also just having the facilities at UW. I mean, that's what I hope to do. It is hard to do at scale sometimes, like with such a large number of students, but you know, I try, you know, I try my best, you know,
yeah, for
to help
sure.
bridge that gap because there is a gap there.
So coming out of that experience, then that 7 month internship, did you feel like I have to imagine you came out like almost a different person by the end of that, between the experience of being in Hawaii, having traveled to California for the first time, and
Hmm.
then having just this being exposed to these people. Like, do you feel, maybe it's hard to remember. I don't know. You said that was multiple years ago,
It
but
seems like yesterday,
really,
but yeah, it was like 20 years ago. It was in 2002.
do you feel like you came out like almost an entirely different person from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a lot about the people that you meet. I mean, it sounds that yeah. So it was. I think the number of people that I had met and just new experiences it was yeah huge. And then Hawaii was awesome. I mean, I bought a motorcycle and I motorcycled everywhere, all over the island, and
That sounds so
um,
much fun.
it was a blast, and it was really the first time. Yeah, it's just yeah, it's
True
the
freedom.
motorcycle was yeah, it was freedom. If the motorcycle, it was the first time that I realized like why I love motorcycles so much because it felt like an exoskeleton. I just jumped on that motorcycle and I could just like go up that mountain and just like go up the volcano. And it was just like, it was like, a jet suit or something. I mean, it was just like you could go anywhere. I could go through rivers. I could be flying along the ocean. I mean,
Yeah, that's crazy.
it was awesome. So,
Did that experience kind of open up? Because for me, there's kind of there's a couple pivotal moments, but I think especially when you're younger, the world feels pretty closed off at times. And then slowly as
mhm.
you, and this is part of growing up, which is like you slowly get indications that like, oh, I can do more things and the world can open up. But then there's going to be some pivotal experiences that prove to you that like, oh, I could probably almost do anything. And I think for me, like the Jetsuit experience was one thing of
Right,
like starting
right.
off being like, I don't know at all what I'm doing. And by within 2 years, I'm like, I am doing things now. I ended up in California. I built jetpacks professionally for a while. Like I
Mm,
ended up doing things that I never thought would I couldn't even have dreamed of doing initially
mm,
because it just seemed so it didn't even seem like possible really. And
mm.
I don't want to border on like even cliche, but like it does open up in a way where you start to view the world differently as to what's possible and what opportunities are available. But then you realize you can go after those and it's actually not nearly as difficult as you think it is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was still in a low gear, I would say, like a transmission analogy.
Yeah, yeah.
There were so many other shifts after that, but that was certainly, I mean, me going, and I had some shifts before that, because like I said, even going from art to engineering was not an easy task, at all. So that was a huge shift. Like once I got into engineering and started doing well in the classes, that was maybe gear one. You're right. But even GE and every single thing felt like a gear shift. So I would just say it felt like another gear shift of like a 30 gear transmission that I was, and you kind of take it, you rev it out, you go all the way, and then you shift to the next one. So I was still feeling like I was accelerating for sure. In engineering, I was still thirsty and hungry. I wanted to learn more. I was excited. But your jet suit, that didn't occur to me. That didn't happen to me until later on. That's in 2007, and when I built an
Mm.
electric motorcycle, and we could chat about that later. But
Yeah, well, let's kind
but
of let's
that
kind
that
of
was the jet suit for me. What you
yeah.
described with the jet suit, that didn't happen to me like in that direct analogy till 2007, where I felt like I was doing truly what I was interested in. Now, I was super interested in telescopes. I was super interested in jet engines, but I was mainly doing it because it was a job. I was
Right.
thinking more the job. I was completely free when I built that motorcycle, like probably the jet suit for you, because I
Yeah.
was like, I'm doing what, not in a selfish way, but just in a direct drive. Like I feel like
If
this
I
is
could if I,
me.
if I could
This is
choose if
me.
I could
Yeah.
choose anything to do and go after
Right.
that, that's what this
Right.
would be. Yeah, interesting.
Right.
So yeah, let's dig
Yeah.
into that a bit. So how did you what was your first indication that that was something you decided you wanted to do? And especially the other thing is like I suppose now maybe saying an electric motorcycle that might not sound as big of a deal because now we're talking about electric
Right.
VTOL aircraft and we're talking about
Right.
electric cars. But
Right.
in 2007, that's probably actually a lot more on the edge than people might realize at first.
Yeah.
Um,
You couldn't buy them. Maybe they're kind of like, yeah, yeah, they're similar. Well, that skips over a lot, which is fine. We could skip over it, but that kind of, so in between,
well, sorry, let's go hold on before we
oh,
go into
yeah,
that. Let's go back then.
yeah,
So you end up finishing out your internships, you finish out school a
yeah.
little bit. What do you do after you graduate undergrad?
Well, this is so I was in I one of the forks in the road kind of came even when I was in Hawaii. I pretty much made up my mind. There's no way I'm going to go to grad school.
Mm.
And I, so even that like with students too is even like you. I'll still try to maybe, and I haven't, but maybe I should try to convince you to go back to grad school because I was completely convinced. And I remember vividly being there's a road going one way, and I was like, I could either go back right now and study for the GREs, or I'm gonna take this motorcycle up this volcano here. And I'm like,
Never look back.
I'm not gonna study. I am just done with studying. And so I took the motorcycle and I skipped studying and just went up into the motorcycle. But then later on, which is fine, I'm glad I didn't pressure myself. Later, when I went back to finish up undergrad down in Urbana-Champaign, I just remember sitting there, I was in the back steps of my apartment with my mom, and I was like, "Mom, I think I want to go to grad school at MIT." And it just kind of came out of nowhere, and so that was just it just, again, that's the dreamer side. It just came out. It just like, that's my next dream. I don't know why. And I'm not only that, the most important thing is that I was motivated. I was very
Mm,
motivated. Because I don't know how much this resonates with you, and we could talk about this later on. It's something that I talk with students a lot about, is for me at least, and I think in general, motivation is the fuel. Like if I don't have motivation, I am nothing. I can't even get up in the morning.
dude, that
And if I
resonates.
have
That
motivation,
resonates.
I am okay. Yeah.
That resonates so much with me. I don't know what it is, and I think I have a little bit more disagreeable. I think I'm a little bit more disagreeable. And because of that, I have a very hard time doing things that I find to be either what I either deem as a waste of time, or
Right.
if I find that there are a lot of times where I find things to be trivial and I'm like, is there really a benefit to this? And part of that is that over analysis too.
Mm,
And because of that, I'm just like, I'm often I have a drive for not wasting time. And so because of that, then I'm like, I'm going to focus on the things that I want to do. And if I don't want to do it, or this isn't interesting to me, then and maybe I give up. I don't want to say give up. Maybe I cut things off a little too quickly sometimes, but there are
hmm.
times where I'm
Yeah.
like, if this is not interesting to me or I don't have that motivation, it's very difficult for me to push through it. Now, again, long term, if it's like, I know this is leading to something better and maybe this is
Right.
tedious now, but if I can see the long term for it, then that can help provide motivation. But
Right.
but again, like working on a jet suit, I put so many hours into that felt like they just went by, and
Yeah.
it was effortless almost because I was so motivated and driven by the positive feedback. But in
Yeah.
times, I mean, again, it sounds like you're similar where it's like if you don't have that motivation, it drags.
It's just the engines aren't even lit.
Yeah.
And that's what I guess, even when I was all of a sudden my engines just fired, and it was just like, that's just, and for my own, it's not, it was just my own thing. But I think you were talking, I guess we were talking about kind of motivation. You were talking about the incremental steps, because a lot of times there are incremental steps. In fact, kind of that's how I would summarize the whole first undergrad, even into grad school, is a lot of incremental steps. Everyone seemed interesting. That is a
Hmm.
challenge because I know a lot of people, um, they're not interested in the incremental steps, like the in between, and there are a
Yeah.
lot of in between steps. And I'm kind of summarizing the big steps, but they're, the little steps are like getting up every morning and working hard. I mean, that's,
Yeah.
and you have to be motivated sometimes by a bigger dream or a bigger vision. But you're right, we're sharing. Yeah, we both agree the motivation is key, but it's even more nuanced in the sense of, you've probably heard the Stanford study about kids with the two marshmallows versus the one marshmallow.
Yep.
It's a little bit like that. I mean, a lot of times you just have to hold, and you do have to put up with some of the discomfort or the annoyance with something, because
Let's summarize.
you want the two marshmallow.
Let's
Uh,
summarize that quick, just in case
yeah,
anybody listening is unfamiliar with the study.
yeah. I mean, I don't remember all the details, but the things that I took away from it is that they looked at kids when they were babies, and they offered each kid, they did it for quite a few different kids, and they offered them one marshmallow now, or if they waited a certain amount of time, they could have two marshmallows, and so the kid got to choose.
Delayed
And
gratification.
right, it's kind of delayed gratification. Well, it is, yeah, delayed gratification. That's kind of what I was looking at. And so, if I remember correctly, they went back later on, years later, and looked at these kids, and the kids that were willing to wait for the two marshmallows, had better outcomes in their life,
Yep. Yep.
along certain metrics that they looked at. I see this with my own kids too. It's really interesting. So, so that was, I guess, what I was saying there is that there are a lot of incremental steps, and you do have to wait for the two marshmallows with a lot of things. But at that time, I guess, getting to the motivation piece is that I was willing to do the incremental. There was, even though once I made up my mind that started sounded interesting, like I wanted to go to grad school at MIT. Well, again, there's nothing guaranteed in that. That was just like a dream.
Hmm.
So now comes the incremental steps. I want the two marshmallows. I'm willing to put in the work. And so that was where, I applied and had to go through the process and things like that. So that was, so anyway, but I ended up getting in, and I had a few options, but in the end, I chose MIT because I kind of appreciated the value of hands-on learning and some of that stuff, which ended up being true. It was a really great place for that.
Yeah, did you find that MIT I think they have a reputation of being a little bit better about that than some of the other schools, if I'm correct?
It's yes, they definitely are. I mean, it was a perfect fit for me. I mean, yeah, in a lot of ways. I was mainly deciding between Caltech and MIT, which I know seems like two really awesome choices to have, which is true. But Caltech is awesome too, but Caltech tends to be a little bit more on the theoretical side, and things could have changed now. So that, again, that's a lesson that I kept having to learn, and sometimes I learned it the hard way. Is that I just really value hands-on work. So in that case, I think I really made the right choice for me. I think it was good. Um, but that was kind of, I guess we were kind of the transition from undergrad to grad school. So
Well, so then basically was it grad school then? I want to get into the electric stuff.
oh, right. Okay,
And
so
so
I'll fast
yeah,
forward
well,
here. Right.
yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah.
a lot in between there, but I'll. So I went away to grad school, and this is actually where it takes a major twist.
Mm,
Is that I actually was completely burnt out, and so this is something I've been able to talk to a lot of students about, which I'm glad I had this experience, but it was quite painful. Is that I was completely burnt out. I mean, I had been speaking of firing, using the firing the engine analogies. You know, I went away to master's degree out to Boston, new place, new people. And I
it's
think
hard.
yeah, everything was fine academically for the most part, but my project that I had chosen was too theoretical. And so this kind of gets into that lesson that I've had to learn over and over again. And then
Mm,
eventually now I know it for sure, which is
right.
I just really enjoy hands-on projects. So I dropped out of grad school, and I finished off the semester, and then I dropped out of grad school, and I traveled around the world for like 7 months, and just was going to be done. I mean, I was done with grad school, and then I think I was flying. I was over Thailand. Is kind of when I remember that again that the engine started firing again. I'm like, you know what? I think I'm motivated again. I think I could go back if I could learn from those lessons of trying to find a more hands-on project, not
Mm.
just purely theoretical. So anyway, I went back after that, and I finished in a year and a half. So it was 2 years total. And then I went to Germany for 3 months on a fellowship, and then I went to India for 3 months on a fellowship, and then I drove my motorcycle across the country, and then I started working at JPL. And then when I was working at JPL as a full-time engineer, in the evenings is when I started kind of had this moment experience like you with the jetpack. So I was working on telescopes again at
Hmm.
JPL, but I became interested in electric mobility, and so then I started building this electric motorcycle, and that was kind of the another significant event for me, kind of like your Jetsuit.
So I want to dig into that a little bit, but one thing that just kind of came to my mind while you were talking about that, right? And I don't know if you talk to students about this, but maybe if you're looking for something to talk to them about, it seems like a lot of people find this particularly insightful from what I've found. But a lot of people ask me, because there are times throughout my life when I've done things and people have commented that they wish they were as passionate about something as
Mm-hmm.
I am. And there's been a couple different things that people have commented that on. And I do a lot of, do you know what parkour is? I do a lot of
Yep.
that.
No, I've seen
So
some of your videos.
yeah,
Yeah,
so
they're
I do a
super
lot
cool.
of that, and
Yeah.
I remember even in high school, I remember my mom saying like, "Wow, I wish I had something in life that was
Yeah.
like I was as passionate about
Right.
as you are." And then same thing with the jet suit. But what I think I've found to be true is that people seem to think that like either you have passion, like a passion, or you don't, and you kind of have to like look inside yourself and you'll find it or not. And I have found that that's not particularly true. I found that it starts off as just an interest, and there's a little voice that says, "Oh, that could be kind of cool." And what you
Mm-hmm.
start doing is you slowly start working on it, and it might be that it's not that interesting or you're misinformed about it and you go to the next thing. But if it is something that you're interested in and you slowly start working on it and you slowly start making progress, you build passion, and that's something that actually comes over time. Because one thing was like, again, if we take the Jetsuit project, I wasn't instantly passionate about it. I thought it was something that would be cool or that could be interesting, and it was over time of working on it and making progress, then I became obsessed with it, and then I built a passion for it. But it wasn't like I was instantly passionate about jetpacks. I just thought they were mildly interesting. And I'm curious if that was kind of your experience with, let's say, like motorcycles and things like that. And I don't know if that
Yeah.
resonates at all with you, but that's
Yeah, it
kind of what I've
does.
found.
I mean, I think you were saying you were using the word passion and interest, I guess were two words that jumped out to me. And so I would say for me, I think, and maybe this is what you're getting at, is that it really, you mentioned it's interest. It's less passion. I mean, the passion comes, but I mean, to me, it's all about curiosity. So
Hmm.
you became curious, basically,
Yeah,
the interest,
yeah.
it's synonymous with kind of curiosity and interest. So yeah, I think it was like that for me with everything pretty much, is that if I become curious about something, it then eventually, not with everything, I get curious about other things that are dead ends. I'm
Oh
just like,
yeah, for
I'm
sure.
not that interested in it anymore. But every once in a while you become curious about something and it starts to build. And there's a little bit of a feedback loop. You kind of alluded to some of this, is that you start experimenting, testing, and your curiosity increases. Um, and so I think that's definitely the true is that I think but I don't know if curiosity is something that can be learned, or is it a personality? I'm not sure.
So from what I can tell, I think it has a large part to do with personality. There are some people who are far more open, some people who are far more um, curious, and there are some people who legitimately just aren't interested. Because
Yeah.
I know people who are interested in everything. They want to learn
Yeah.
about everything, and
Right.
if it's something new, they want to know about it. And there are some people that just couldn't care less. They don't have, and now again, some of it is learning to engage some of that. But I think from what I can tell, part of it at least is a personality trait. So that's unfortunate if that's hard if you aren't somebody who's particularly curious. Um, but if I imagine a lot of people they do have some interest. And this gets into an interesting thing that I think a lot about recently, which is like social media, because, and I'm curious if you see this with students a lot actually, but one thing that I'm a little concerned about is that people, especially younger people, if they spend too much time looking at what other people are valuing,
Yeah.
I'm concerned that they lose the ability to start to figure out what they value and what their
Hmm.
thoughts are. Because if you're constantly looking for feedback from the outside world about what you should do, how you should spend your time, what you should value, then you actually don't know how to consult yourself to figure out what am I interested in? What things stand out
Hmm.
to me? And I feel like if you ignore that voice for long enough, you actually kind of lose it. And so for me, I enjoy spending time by myself. And so there was a lot of times where I would just sit and kind of pay attention to what, the inner voice of saying like, oh, that could be interesting or this is
Yeah.
cool. And then I'd
Yeah.
slowly pursue those things. And then over time they build into something big and interesting.
Yeah.
But if you're not used to listening to that voice, I know so many people who are like, I'm not interested in anything and I don't know what I want to do. And you're so lucky that it's so clear to you.
Right.
And I'm concerned that with the social media stuff, people lose that ability.
I mean, I think what I've seen with the social media is that, or even just digital content like that, is that people consume, but they don't produce.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that's kind of what you're saying, is that people will start consuming and then they get in consumption mode of like seeing other people.
Do stuff.
But, I've always been of the mindset of I enjoy doing it myself a lot more, even, and I don't mean it in a selfish way. I just mean it in kind of in just joy. Is that like I don't even really like to watch sports, but I love to play sports. Like I
Oh
will
yeah.
play any sport, basketball, football, but I just can't even stand to watch them. But it's the same kind of thing. I mean, in some ways, I don't view that much differently. If you're watching someone have this amazing TikTok experience or whatever, and then
Hmm.
watching a football player, but I mean, I know that there are people that are really good at it that really you enjoy just watching how good they are.
Right.
But I'm even less concerned with like how good someone is versus I just like to have it. I like to have the experience myself, be it throw a football, catch a football, or go travel, or things like that. So anyway, that like with social media, that's the only thing that I've noticed is that people are kind of switching into a consumption mode versus a produce or
Production. Yeah.
experience, or not product. I mean, saying like producing an experience for yourself
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
with friends and others, or producing a meaningful relationship or whatever. They just consume stuff like digital content. But I'm not an expert there, but that's just kind of one thing that I've noticed. But
So, okay. So then going back to, so in terms of producing, then you decided that electric motorcycles were something that, um, again, at that time, that's more of a niche thing. So how did you
Yeah, it
decide that
was, they were not
electric was
around.
the?
Yeah, you couldn't buy one. I really liked motorcycles, as I mentioned. I had done a lot of motorcycling at that point, and I had a little bit of conflict, I think, because I like motorcycles, but then I could also see just it being in Los Angeles, I didn't own a car there. I had my motorcycle, the one that I drove across the country. And so I had that motorcycle, and then I had my bicycle, and I bicycled everywhere for the most part. And so I eventually got smog-induced asthma
Oh.
from bicycling everywhere. And so I was just like, all the smog here, all the pollution. I was like, but I love motorcycles. And so that was kind of where that bubbled up out of, is
Hmm.
that I'm like, we really need some cleaner transportation options. And so I kind of married that with my desire for motorcycles, and also the hands-on learning, the engineering, that
So
kind of
did
stuff was, yeah.
were you I don't know a good word for it. I don't want to say ridiculed, but did people kind of look at you kind of crazy when you started talking about making an electric motorcycle? Was that something that, or again, being kind of in the field that you're in, was that more
Hmm.
supported, or did people
I
just
think it
not
was
care one way or
supported.
another?
Yeah. I mean, I even remember taking it to the people at JPL and others, and they're like, yes, do more of that. Like, just the
Mm.
idea of, yeah, they were very supportive. And they're like, whatever you're doing, you should just do more of that, whatever it is. I'm not sure what this is, this thing that you're driving there, but just keep do more of it. So,
How long did it
yeah, no,
take you
people
to
were very encouraging.
from conception to, let's say, final product? What was that timeline like?
Um, I had a lot to learn. When I first started thinking about it, I didn't know how to weld. And so I had to take some welding classes at the community college there. So
Mm.
there was, again, a bit of the incremental steps that were required. I had done quite a bit of machining already as part of my master's degree at MIT. Yeah, that's really where I got involved with the machine shop. So it was like probably a year or something like that, but it required me to go take the welding classes and, do that. And then I was working full time, but I must admit that I got pretty obsessed with it. I didn't have any kids. I wasn't married or anything. So yeah, I just spent every opportunity I could to
Through
be working
freedom.
on it for about, yeah, at least 6 months, or 3 to 6 months. It was really intense. It was probably, just a few months, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But the whole idea that I had, that I wanted to do, is I wanted to build one out of new components. There were some other people building some electric motorcycles at the time, but I wanted to show that they could be done cheaply. And so I bought all the components new and put it together, and it was $3,000. So I was trying to, again, demonstrate the affordability that electric vehicles in general could be. They didn't have to be
Hmm.
super expensive.
I'm kind of going into that a little bit. I've been spending some time, especially with my new job now. I've been working with some different electric vehicles, VTOL and cars.
Yep.
Have your thoughts on electric vehicles changed at all? Because I think that they are, as an electrical engineer, I find them really interesting and I think they're really cool, but also I'm learning all the trade-offs that they require, and it's
Yeah.
hard to say that they're this perfect magical solution to
Yeah.
all the environmental problems, let's say, that we might
I
think we're
know.
facing. I'm curious what your thoughts on that, on any of that are, if they've changed at all, or do you think electric is still a good path to pursue, or are you starting to think that maybe we need to look for something maybe a bit alternative? I know people are looking into hydrogen right now and things like that. I'm curious what you learned along the way and what your thoughts are there.
That is a very good question. Because it was a long journey there. I mean, that was like the story I was just telling was in like 2006, leading into kind of 2007.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there was a lot that happened between then and then where I'm at now, even in terms of projects I've worked on, and people I've met, and conversations, papers I've written or read. But I guess I'm kind of similar, I would say, to what you described now. I think I've I would say I still think that there's definitely a need for them. Um, I think, to me, I really like bicycles and like just lower energy consuming modes of transportation whenever possible. I think that's
Mhm.
actually the solution. I think e-bikes are awesome. E-bicycles, those have all come in, along that stretch of time. Those weren't really around either at that time. So anyway, there are these other things. I think it's a very complicated um, situation where there's probably no one single solution. I think it's in the direction of where we need to go. But I also have a little bit more of a nuanced view of them now.
Hmm.
Even on an engineering side, we're just not there yet. Even, and I have an electric car now, and I've purchased an electric motorcycle. And the engineering, we're still, there's still a lot of issues with them. There's a lot of failures, and they don't quite have the designs dialed in. So a lot of the reliability issues, there's still a lot of those things, but so we're still not there yet from an engineering side. But I still want to head in that direction. I don't think that there's the one solution that we need, but
Yeah, it's interesting because I agree. And I also I just think that they're super cool. And I'm an
they are
electrical
super
engineer.
cool.
I love all the
Yeah,
stuff that goes in behind it. But with that, I have a view into the nuances and the trade-offs that occur. And something like an electric aircraft, it's really easy to say that, oh, like we want all electric aircraft. But it's like you start looking at the actual numbers of range and things like that. And you're
right,
like, oh, okay, your charge time, if you want to charge this aircraft, yeah, that's going to take like multiple days. And you're like, well, what
yeah,
happens if I need to do 50 flights? And you're like, well, can we swap out a battery each time that we fly? And it's like, well, now we have to store 50 batteries. Like those things are huge. Where are we going to
right,
store them? Like it just gets really complicated. And so it's just really interesting because as I'm in the work that I'm doing now, it's interesting to see a lot of those trade-offs. And
yeah,
and on top of it, again, you learn anything about the electrical grid, and you're like, how in the heck are we going to support producing this much power? Like, it's
right,
pretty crazy. And this was something I learned with building the Jetsuit, which was like, unfortunately, the like diesel still is about 100 times more energy dense than like our current lithium battery
right,
tech, and we are going to need a pretty serious advancement in lithium batteries, or batteries in general may not even be lithium, in terms of rivaling that energy density. So it's just really interesting for me to look at.
it is. But I think on a hopeful side, I would say if it's an engineering challenge, I'm very optimistic. And I think that's kind of what I was mainly talking about. I think there are some, and you were talking about this energy density. I mean, some of it's some of the fundamentals of the physics, but I think one thing that has been awesome over the last 15, 16 years since building that motorcycle, is that consumer demand has changed. So that was
Mm,
something, people actually desire the electric cars now. I think there's going to be some clunkiness here because even me, like buying this electric motorcycle, I bought it and they're expensive, because you're paying for all the, the technology that you're buying, and some of that fuel efficiency, you're paying for that upfront with the battery cost. But I think the consumer demand, like the consumers, the preferences have changed, which is awesome. And so I'm hopeful in that way. I think if consumers demand some different solutions, I'm hopeful that the engineering
will
will
follow.
come around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and
in the direction.
that was Elon Musk's whole goal, wasn't it? It wasn't even to make the best electric car. It was to make something that people would actually want, to
Right,
show that electric cars could be cool. And I mean, it sounds like they've obviously succeeded to some degree because now they're everywhere. And
right. They were
I'm in
definitely part of
California
it.
right now, and it's like they're
Yeah. Oh,
everywhere.
they're yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
so people do want them. They think they look great, they function well. And so you're totally right in that regard. Like that dynamic has completely changed.
Yeah,
So
which is unique. Yeah, it's
it
yeah.
doesn't
There's
normally that doesn't happen very often.
no, no. And I was actually concerned a lot about that early on, 15 years ago, was that because you were mentioning kind of the ridiculing. There was a little bit of that just from just consumer demand side. People were like, a lot of this consumer preference stuff was coming out a lot more. But now I think everyone's like, oh, it's cool. That's neat. But yeah, we've got these engineering challenges. I'm like, okay, well, we can figure those not again, not that you can totally figure them out, but they can be, and they will be certainly improved over
Yeah, oh
the
yeah,
next
for
10,
sure.
10, 15, 20 years.
So one there's so many ways we can go with everything that you've done. I mean, we're only scratching the surface, but I guess with the time that we have left, I kind of want to focus a little bit more on what you currently do.
Mm-hmm.
And with students, again, just the list of the things that you worked on is long, but at what point did things start changing where you started focusing a little less on, let's say, maybe your personal goals, and you started deciding that you wanted to start transferring that to the next generation,
Yep.
or just other people? Was there like how did that shift over time? And what do you
Yep.
do now to kind of, how do you spend your time now in terms of, let's say, um, just engineering and what you do at Madison, like, and how has that changed for you?
Yeah, the big shift came actually follows up what we were just talking about is that from the motorcycle experience, I went back to get the PhD, and I wanted to work on electric vehicles. And just that experiencing of being able to, to pursue my passions and my curiosities. So I went and did that, and MIT just has so many resources. It was just awesome to have that experience of all the resources. And there are a set of resources that I hadn't even experienced before, and
Mm.
we can kind of skip through them. But I created a team, and we went and built an electric motorcycle and raced it over, the oldest motorcycle race. It was a dream. It was another dream. It was a thing like, what would that be like?
The Isle
Isle
of
of Man,
Man.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And went
That's
to the Isle of
crazy.
Man, and that's skipping over a lot of details, which is fine. And but the main thing kind of is like what you're getting at now, which is, I think that experience just that started inspiring me of getting into the makerspace, the design and innovation space, working with students, working at a university, and so through that process, I kind of started getting into building up makerspaces at MIT, and then went to Singapore and some other places, and got into this like making shops, making things that make things, the organizations that make
Mm.
things. And so, yeah, really, that's kind of why even coming here to UW is that just in my experience, I mean, what I try to do is just help give resources to students, give them, if I can help them with their designs, like help them in that way, just because of those experiences that I had, how valuable they were and how fun and liberating it is. Because I know as a student, a lot of times they don't feel like they have resources. And coming to some of the facilities, I try to make it that they feel empowered, that they can collaborate with others and do whatever they would, what are they daydreaming about essentially.
Do you find that students have a lot of, I don't know if they express any of this to you, but do you find that students have a lot of angst around what they're trying to do in their time at school? Because I think back to when I was in school, and even coming out of school, I think I had a lot more in the year or two after school of trying to figure out, like, where am I going? Like, I was playing this
Mm-hmm.
game for a long time of trying to get the grades and trying to graduate, and you had this goal of graduating, and then you suddenly graduate and you're like, I've now walked this path that is now ended, and it's now suddenly a field in which I could go anywhere and do anything, and now I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Do you
Yep.
find that do you find students come to you with those kinds of questions at all? And if so, like, with your breadth of experience, do you have good advice for them about how to handle that at all?
I mean, the main thing I tell them, at least what I experience, is you can do anything in your 20s. I don't know if I ever told you that, but you can do whatever you want in your 20s. And I think some students don't realize that. I mean, obviously, that's not completely true. And especially if you have some health issues or family constraints or financial
Generally
constraints.
speaking, yeah.
Right. But and I had a lot of those too in some ways. And I know there's other issues like I'm not, it's just my experience. And it's more trying to try to encouragement is that, hey, when you're at that point, like what you're describing, is like you can do whatever you want. And hopefully that feels freeing. Like you're like, oh
Hmm.
my gosh, I don't have chains on me. Um, so especially with a degree in engineering, from a good school.
Hmm.
So I try, that's kind of the first thing I do is just like, start dreaming big. You can do anything in your 20s. And I definitely experienced that myself. But it does require taking risks, and you certainly have experienced that for sure.
No
Sometimes
doubt.
they're career risks, financial risks, personal safety risks, like you've
Yeah.
taken some of those. I've
Yep.
taken those. So there's a lot of different types of risk, and some people don't like certain kind of risks. Like they're probably not like you and me, and they're not willing to strap themselves to something that they've made,
Oh
like we
yeah.
are.
Yeah.
But it's exciting to us, but it's not. It's not to them. So, but there are other kind of risks. I mean, there's like financial risk, professional risk. So I guess sometimes you can do anything in your 20s kind of thing. And then the other thing I try to mention to them, and I have said this many times, is that time seems like it's so compressed when you're
Hmm.
younger. You're like, oh my gosh, I got to decide now. It's like, it's like I'm already 20. They'll be like, I'm 22 years old or 23. Or usually I say, how old are you? And they'll be like, I'm
Yeah.
22 or 20. I'm like, 22, 23, 24. It's all kind of in the noise. I mean, even maybe 25, 26, 27. I mean, maybe it's becoming significant in terms of time, but just saying, hey, don't rush. Just stretch it out. Um, so that's kind of another thing I think is so. I guess both of those things I mentioned, I try to them to think outside the box, and in the end, if they just want to go get a job, that's totally fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But some people maybe they're looking for that little nudge or that new insight, and I have seen that with students. I could give examples, but some of them said, hey, I really appreciate you saying that. I was thinking time was compressed, and they just decided, you know what, I am gonna go study abroad for that semester, or I am gonna, after graduation, take 6 months off and go backpack through Europe, or I'm gonna start this project, or whatever it is, try to do something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, I don't want to border on cliche, but what I'll say is I definitely felt that, especially as I got out of school. And the when I was picking my first job, I ended up at Milwaukee Tool. It,
Hmm.
that decision of like, what's my first job going to be? I don't know what it was, but it felt like this is like the most important decision of my life. And
Right,
it also feels like this is deciding where my life is
right,
going
right.
forever. And
Yep,
it's not until you get into your first job, but you realize like, oh, a year is a long time. And also like I could change jobs. I could work someplace for a year, change my job, and I could do that 7 times and I'm not even 30 yet. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
right,
And
right.
so,
No,
but
there's a
it
lot
but
of
it
time.
wasn't
Yeah, there's a lot of time.
in school though. I felt very similar in that way. And the other
Yeah.
part of that too is like to the taking risks point. I think one
Hmm.
thing that I got particularly good at, and I think this was from parkour, which was like learning to assess risk properly. Um, which was like, yeah, it's risky, but also it's not as risky as you actually think that it is. And so if you sit down and kind of do some of those calculations of like, well, like let's say with the jet suit, right? It was like I had to ask myself, well, am I really going to even attempt doing this? Like it sounds risky. But at the end of the day, it was like, okay, if I buy the first engine and none of this works out, maybe I'm down some money, but like I can always
Right,
make more money. I have health insurance. I don't have kids. I like
right.
this isn't going to ruin me if it doesn't work. And so
Hmm.
I might as well try it and kind of see what happens. And maybe I'll learn some stuff along the way. And you do that a little bit and you realize, oh, that actually worked out. And it wasn't as scary or as crazy as I thought it was. And then you're
Hmm.
like, huh, well, then the ceiling kind of moved up a little bit. So what's the next step? And oh, that seems pretty crazy. Like I don't think I could do that. And then you go do it and you're like, oh, well, okay, well, and then it just if you keep iterating on that, then you end up doing things. And I mean, this sounds from like your experience where you end up in a position that you never could have even imagined in the first place because it was just not within your realm. But yeah, I mean, if you would have told me back when I was at the makerspace, like this is what I would be doing 3 years later,
Hmm.
3, 4 years later, it wouldn't even have been in my realm of thinking that this was possible.
Yeah, there's
So
certainly a lot of those incremental steps too, which I think, and that can be overwhelming for a lot of people. And so that's something I definitely try to communicate too, is just kind of more heuristics, even if, and you mentioned this before, is like, what if they don't know what they want to do, is just kind of heading in a direction just with small incremental steps. And that's kind of what you said about
you'll learn
even
along the
with
way.
even with risk. Yeah, you can you can take incremental steps, but there's risks can look a lot of different ways for different people.
Mhm.
And so, but definitely there's that part of, certainly as you get, I mean, at least as I got older, the equations all do start to change. And so that is part of the reason, even how I kind of ended up here in some ways, is that it was 6 years ago, but my equations had all changed because at that point I had 2 kids and I was married, and that changes things too, which is totally a normal, fine thing. It's awesome.
I think that's part of growing.
Yeah, it's just part of growing. You age, and so yeah, so I think that's kind of when students are at those junctions. I think experiences too can lead to a lot of different outcomes. So just if students haven't had some kind of set of experiences, maybe that's the reason why they're not sure what they want to do. So just that's kind of getting back to the just get on the bus, just get on the bus.
Hmm.
Like if there seems to be something going that direction, hey, just jump on, go for it, try it, take the risk,
Well, and that's
and make some plans. Hopefully that. you can mitigate the risks in various ways, even in terms of like when I went um, and did those, I did a 3 month in Germany and 3 months in India. I had mitigated some of my risk. I didn't have a job, a full-time job when I left, and so I was
Hmm.
basically a one-way ticket going that direction without a job. But I tried to mitigate my risks, and then I ended up working at JPL. But so you can take risk, new experience, but mitigate them to try to minimize any kind of super bad outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think the other part that I've realized, I've taken this to heart a bit, and I've listened to a lot of videos of, let's say, older people looking back on their life. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I don't want to border on cliche, but what a lot of people say is they often end up regretting things that they didn't try, not the mistakes
Mm-hmm.
they made along the way. And that's a constant reminder for me of like, again, I look at like the whole Jetsuit thing to come back because it's just such a big example. And it's like, even if it didn't work, I could imagine being later in my life looking back, being like, shit, like I wish I would have tried. Just I wish I would have tried
Mm-hmm.
it. And even if it didn't work, I wish I would have tried doing it. And now again, like mistakes were made along the way and things like that. But again, no regrets whatsoever. And I think most people
Yeah.
find that where it's like, yeah, it is scary and it is hard and you're unsure and but by the time that you've made your way through it, you're like, wouldn't trade it for the world. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true.
I think this is a good place to end. Man, there's so much more I want to talk to you. So maybe we'll have to set up another point because I want to talk to you about your experience with working on the ISS labs and
Mm-hmm.
your traveling, your time in Russia. Like, there's so much
A
that
lot of travel, a lot of
yeah,
traveling.
I know. And
Yeah.
honestly, there's a whole bucket. There's probably a whole list of things you learned along the way there. But
Mm-hmm.
in our limited time here, I think this is a good place to end. So thanks for chatting with me. This has been really fun on my end. And again, like I knew some of this about you, but it's been fun chatting about it more in depth.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot for reaching out, and I enjoyed chatting with you too.
Yeah, no problem. All right. We'll have to set something up again sometime, but have a good rest of your weekend.
Sounds good. All right, see you, Will.
See ya. Thank you for listening to my discussion with Lennon Rodgers. If you would like to learn more about Lennon, I have linked his work portfolio in the description below. Thank you for taking your time to listen to my podcast, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.